Chapter 4 of Nehemiah demonstrates that a community is often threatened as much by internal weakness as by external attack. In fact, our enemies often have no power if we individually and collectively retain our own integrity. The sad little poem sung by the Judeans in verse 10 of chapter 4 not only depicts things at their worst, but it also has the effect of pulling down the morale of everyone else. Lack of concentration on the task at hand, as seen in verse 11, could also erode the basis for security. And finally, the call of fellow members of the community who put self-preservation above community goals threatened to lure the people to defection, weakness, and defeat. This chapter also includes a disturbing imprecatory prayer, or a prayer that invokes judgment and calamity on our enemies or those we perceive to be the enemies of God. In verses 4 and 5, Nehemiah asks God to punish his adversaries with the threats they had aimed at him, and he asks God not to forgive them. This seems to rail against the teaching of Jesus that we see in the Gospels, where he admonishes us to love our enemies and pray for those who abuse us. But we should hesitate before assigning Nehemiah's prayer too quickly to an inferior ethical domain. Nehemiah saw the attacks of Sanballat and his allies as a direct threat to God's plans for Israel. Now, that too could be a dangerous attitude to have, as we can see all too often throughout history, where groups of people have automatically considered their enemies to also be God's enemies. And that, of course, is simply not always true. Imprecatory prayers have this to their credit, though. They flow from a spirit that knows it can tell God anything, even if God finally chooses the route of forgiveness and reconciliation. The greatest thing about deep human relationships is that we can share with the other person exactly what's on our mind. So it is with a good and faithful relationship with God. We trust God enough to share our deepest pain, our anguish, hurt, and anger. This chapter articulates an excellent mixture of the physical and spiritual in carrying out our calling. Nehemiah responded to the first external threat he encounters in this chapter with prayer, but to the second he responded with prayer and the setting up of a guard. Conditions had changed, and Nehemiah didn't make the mistake of only praying while neglecting to take concrete actions through which God could provide deliverance. At a time of crisis, not only did he invoke the memories of holy war, but he also assigned his elite troops, the burden bearers, and the builders themselves to concrete actions of self-defense. Nehemiah proved his enemies wrong when they said they are not prepared for what we are going to do to them. In this week's interview, pay attention to any ways that opposition from within or beyond the Madison Street community may have affected the rebuilding process and how we as a community of faith persevered.
The one that I remember the most was whether we were going to have a center aisle or 2 aisles like we always have.
Yes.
And then that was just because so many wanted to go back to what we'd always had. We had come to learn that it works so much better with one center aisle.
So what ended up being the deciding factor to going to one center aisle?
Well, at that time we sent out a lot of surveys to everyone, and everyone got a chance to indicate what they thought about everything that was going on, and which was really good, so everybody was involved. And a lot of times we just had to count the votes and see which way. It was not just a group that took over and did it. It was involved, everybody was here.
Susie?
I still think the towers. I think that still was a comment. People still ask that, when are you all going to finish the towers?
Right.
You're going to be finished.
I think the other area was whether or not we needed to acquire additional land for parking. And I know that some people felt we didn't need it. I know I would have loved to have had the property behind the church as opposed to front, because so many people park coming in the back. We don't have enough parking. I think if you look at what we did, and we sort of compromised with getting land across the street from us, and then later the building we're using for the arts. academy. But the Episcopal Church really is very, very landlocked, has problems with parking. That's why they're hoping, a private group will come in and build something behind them and provide parking to the Presbyterian Church by the same token. And you look at what the Baptist Church did with buying the warehouse property and turning around and leasing it to the county for parking so that they have no expense on it, no upkeep on it. I just think that it's hard to have a vision of what you're going to need 20, 30 years out. I think that's the most difficult thing about planning for any organization. 5 years, 10 years maybe the most, but really you need to look at some things. And I know I always said, they don't make any more land. And if you don't get it when you have the opportunity to get it, you may never have that opportunity again. And I think there was some strong words said about those issues.
Jerry, I was at that point completing my doctoral studies in Wesleyan theology and the poor. And so that was a program that really the subject matter just transformed my life. I had a beloved gentleman here. I ended up doing his funeral a few years later. He was wonderful. But he came to me soon after I got here, and he said, "Preacher, we've heard about all we need to hear about poor people." And he said, "You think you can move on?" And I was standing right in the old sanctuary, and I said to him, "Well, here's the dilemma. What you leave me with, okay, are some really ticked off prophets and judges. Paul, okay, and the apocalypse. Where would you like for me to begin?" Okay? And he just smiled and laughed, and he said, "Preacher, you won't do." But my point is that, I said to our group that was in that study, in that degree program, I said, "Guys, if we don't watch out, this is going to make a Christian out of all of us." And so it was just really, I think, a wake-up call for me that you really can't follow Jesus and not bump into the poor, okay? And, good, bad, or indifferent, this congregation had a reputation of sort of keeping the poor at arm's length, okay? And that really opened the door for us, to begin ministries. That's where the Sarah Mann Center came into play with urban ministries. That's where, at that point, Sunday dinner was started, and there was just a real effort and focus on reaching beyond ourselves into the community and so forth. And there was some pushback about that, of course, but there was enough energy and commitment to it to stay firm and move forward. Right.
Yeah, just building on what Doug said, I think the issue is that we became so concerned with rebuilding the church as we do it, rather than thinking about rebuilding the church that meets these future needs of the community. And I think that was a challenge. We loved the church the way it was, and that was our driving focus. Get it as close to as it was as we could get. But I've always looked around, like I say, across the street, that would have been a wonderful place to put a retirement community in the downtown. And some things like this, that opportunities that we've lost, that we may never, ever have again. And I regret that.
When I first came here and was being introduced to people around town, thinking back on it, the typical response from folks was, "Welcome to Clarksville. You have such a beautiful church building." over and over again, and they were right. This was one of the most beautiful, finely appointed buildings I had ever seen in my life, okay? I wish I had a nickel for every dry hydrangea arrangement we had, okay? All right, but it was gorgeous, okay? Well, one of the signs of a downtown church, when it's on decline, okay, is that people talk more about the building than they do about the people and the ministry. Well, this beautiful jewel of a building was gone. And so now it wasn't you have such a beautiful building. Within time, after the rebuild and so forth, the comments were, oh, you all the people that do such and such. You don't have this ministry, right? And I thought, finally, because buildings come and go, but ministry is based in relationships, of what it's about.
Something I've noticed through the years, probably more since the tornado, is an evolution of the families that are using our preschool. When my children were there, it was pretty much mostly church families with some others, friends of church families. And a lot of people, actually, it was a drawing card for young families looking for a church home too. But now, I would say the vast majority of families that are involved in the preschool start out at the preschool and eventually become members because they like what they see, and they see a mission of service to all sorts of needs, and they just recognize that atmosphere. And I think what we've done has really been able for us to expand our mission throughout the whole community for that reason.
Lisa Martin was on the renovation team. She was on staff. And Lisa was pivotal in working with that group, with casting a vision and bringing up ideas and possibilities for the future that perhaps we couldn't see today. And a lot of that worked its way into that overall plan. And she was very, very important and vital in that process. Oftentimes when she'd bring those matters up or ideas up, there would be pushback. And it's we've never done that before. Why do we need to do that? This was so huge, or such a monumental kind of project. It was hard to wrap your mind around, okay? Not just the money, okay, in terms of $8 million, what, okay? But in terms of ministry, that, and to know that we're building in many ways for people who are not here yet. Now that takes faith, okay? We have our pews, we have our Sunday school classrooms the way they used to be, but we're building for people who haven't come yet, right? Which is a statement of positivity and encouragement. We're going to grow, Don't know who they are, but they're coming.
Ready for me to refocus?
I've got one more comment on the building that we lost. Since I didn't grow up in this church and we had been here a long time, every once in a while, in wandering around looking for something, I would find a part of the church that was not being used anymore. For example, above what had been the chapel of years past, it was kind of almost like a balcony type arrangement with what had been classrooms, and that's where all the unused furniture and various things were stored. And I thought, what a shame. So, quite honestly, if we really think about it, the church we lost was not perfect and was not completely usable. And what we have now is very purposeful. I feel like, particularly the children's area. I feel like we are really taking care of future generations of Madison Street members with what we've used as a replacement, what we have now.
I'll just say one more thing about the old building. I'm worried about this one a lot, but I'm worried about it too. It was a wood structure, and we could have had a major disaster. It worried me every Christmas Eve. Sitting there, the Christmas tree was a cedar tree. I remember Bill brought one up. It was probably 20 feet tall, and weighed 3,000 pounds. I think that was the last one of those.
That's right, back in that time, it was only live green.
Live cedar tree. And we had, but that was a big worry, even when we renovated. And because we did what we could, but it was I won't say it was a fire trap, because it wasn't, but it certainly was a ticket box. It wouldn't have taken a lot. Could have gotten on fire pretty quick.
Right.
Along that line, Jerry, when we had the renovation, we had a little fire in the front part of the building. They were, I guess they were doing something with the windows.
Burning paint off.
Yeah, that's right, and it caught on them. They left, and it started burning.
Yeah.
Thank goodness it was put out.
Yeah.
Jerry, I remember if you go to Biltmore at Christmas, they had a live cedar tree in the building that they changed every week.
Good policy. And it's all made of masonry.
Let's refocus on
Talk about opposition. I remember, and Kay will remember this, I'm sure, when we were purchasing altarware and different appointments for the church. We had a gentleman who I'm sure has long passed, but he wanted to pay for the cross.
He was talked into wanting to pay for the
Well, he was rather brusque and abrasive kind of fellow. He was ex-military. He called me up one day. This is about 3 or 4 months into the building process, and wanted to know why we were wasting so much time and why we haven't gotten as far along as he thought we needed to be. And I said to him, we're not building a barn. Okay, this is going to be pretty extensive, and we talked further about that. He ended up paying for the cross. It's what's out there now, of course, and he was sort of soothed a bit about how long this is going to take, the process. It was a matter of just bringing him in on and giving him information that he didn't have, But I don't remember a lot of opposition, or groups that said, oh, no, we're not going to do this.